They taught you that royal blood was pure, divine, superior. They lied. There's a king whose autopsy report is so horrifying that medical students still study it today as the ultimate example of what happens when humans play God with genetics. When they cut him open, the physicians found something that shouldn't be possible in a living body. His heart had shriveled to the size of a peppercorn. His blood had vanished, and his brain was drowning in water. But before we get to that nightmare, before we see what happens when a human body becomes a genetic crime scene, you need to understand how the most powerful family in Europe created a monster. His name was Charles II of Spain, and his family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a circle. November 6, 1661. The Royal Palace of Madrid. The midwives have just delivered the heir to the Spanish throne. The room falls silent. Not the peaceful silence of reverence. The cold silence of horror. The baby's head is grotesquely swollen. His breathing comes in wet, labored gasps. His mouth hangs open, twisted, wrong. Queen Mariana stares at her newborn son and shudders. According to court records, she refuses to nurse him, not out of cruelty, out of instinct. Because Queen Mariana isn't just Charles's mother. She's also his cousin and his aunt. How is that possible? Because King Philip IV had married his own niece, the woman who became both wife and blood relative. The woman who would give birth to a child so genetically compromised that nature itself recoiled. But this didn't happen by accident. This was the result of a deliberate strategy that the Habsburg dynasty had perfected over nearly 2 centuries. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. That was the Habsburg motto. Sounds romantic until you realize they meant marrying each other. Uncles marrying nieces. First cousins marrying first cousins. In some cases, double first cousins, people who shared both sets of grandparents, uniting in matrimony. They called it maintaining the purity of blood. Modern scientists call it genetic suicide. Here's a number that will make your blood run cold. Over 80% of Spanish Habsburg marriages were between close relatives, not distant cousins you might meet at a family reunion and barely recognize. We're talking about people who sat at the same dinner table every Sunday, people who shared grandparents, in some cases, parents. By the time Charles II was born, his family tree had collapsed in on itself like a dying star. All 8 of his great-grandparents descended from the same couple, Philip I and Joanna of Castile. Every single branch of his family tree traced back to the same 2 people. His ancestry didn't branch out. It looped back, over and over, until his DNA became a hall of mirrors. Scientists have calculated something called Charles's inbreeding coefficient. It measures how much of your genome consists of identical copies from shared ancestors. A normal person has a coefficient close to 0. Children of first cousins score around 0.0625. Children born from brother-sister incest score 0.25. Charles II scored 0.254. Think about that. The King of Spain was more inbred than a child of siblings. His genetic code was more tangled, more self-referential, more catastrophically broken than perhaps any human being who ever lived. But numbers are cold. Let me show you what this meant for a living, breathing child. Baby Charles couldn't suckle. His mouth, already deformed, couldn't create the seal needed to feed. In an era before formula, this was a death sentence. Wet nurses were hired, the best in Spain, but they reported something that chilled the court to its core. The infant prince rarely cried, not because he was content, because he seemed to lack the energy. He would lie there, pale and still, his oversized head lolling to one side, his breathing shallow and raspy. The royal physicians, the most educated men in the kingdom, examined the heir and found themselves baffled. They had never seen an infant so fundamentally broken. As months turned to years, the true horror of Charles's condition began to reveal itself. Age 4. 4 years old. Charles still couldn't walk. Not wouldn't. Couldn't. His legs were thin as sticks, bowed from rickets, unable to support even his tiny body weight. Servants carried the future king of Spain everywhere in specially designed chairs. The boy who would command the greatest empire on earth had to be carried like a baby, and he couldn't speak, not a single word. His tongue, already swollen and malformed, filled his mouth. His jaw jutted forward in that infamous Habsburg protrusion. When he finally did speak, sometime after his 4th birthday, the sounds that emerged were slurred, wet, incomprehensible. Court chroniclers delicately noted that His Majesty's speech required interpretation. Let me translate what that means. Charles's tongue was so enlarged it constantly protruded from his mouth. His lower jaw jutted out so far that his lips couldn't close. When he tried to speak, saliva poured from his mouth in streams. Royal attendants stood ready with silk cloths to constantly wipe the drool from the chin of the boy who would be king. The Habsburg jaw. If you've seen portraits of this dynasty, you know it. That distinctive protrusion of the lower jaw. In paintings, artists tried to minimize it, positioning subjects at flattering angles. But Charles? There was no angle that could hide his deformity. Imagine a normal human skull. Now grab the lower jaw and pull it forward several inches. The upper jaw stays where it is. The result is a mouth that can never fully close, teeth that can never meet, a tongue with nowhere to rest. Foreign ambassadors meeting young Charles for the first time struggled to maintain their composure. One French diplomat's private letters described the encounter with barely concealed horror. The prince's appearance defies description. His jaw protrudes so far he appears to have two faces, one stacked in front of the other. When he attempts to eat, food falls from his mouth. When he speaks, one must stand back to avoid the spray. And eating. God, the eating. Charles couldn't chew. Every meal. Every single day of his life. The King of Spain had to swallow his food whole like a pelican. His teeth, upper and lower, were separated by such a gap they never met. Not once. Court dining became an exercise in creative cuisine. Meats cut into tiny pieces. Vegetables pureed. Bread soaked in wine until it dissolved into mush. The English ambassador Alexander Stanhope wrote one of the most visceral descriptions ever penned about a reigning monarch. His Catholic Majesty swallows all he eats whole, for his nether jaw stands so much out that his 2 rows of teeth cannot meet. To compensate, he has a prodigious stomach and swallows a whole lamb at 2 meals. If this revelation about royal genetics shocked you, smash that like button, because what comes next gets so much darker. Physical deformity was just the beginning. Charles suffered from constant illness. Measles nearly killed him at 6. Then chickenpox, leaving his face covered in scars. Then rubella. Then smallpox. Every disease that swept through the palace found in Charles an eager host. His compromised immune system offered almost no resistance. The smallpox was particularly cruel. It struck when Charles was 9. For weeks, he lay between life and death. His already distorted face became a battlefield of pustules and lesions. When he finally recovered, the scars joined the catalog of his disfigurements. But the disease left something else. Something worse. The physicians noticed fluid building up in his skull. His already oversized head began to swell further. Today we call it hydrocephalus, water on the brain. In the 17th century, they called it another curse upon the prince. The pressure caused blinding headaches, vision problems, and possibly the seizures that would plague his later years. By age 10, Charles's education was a source of palace scandal. Not because he was rebellious, but because he simply couldn't learn. Tutors reported that lessons had to be repeated dozens of times. Basic mathematics was beyond him. Latin, the language of royalty and diplomacy, might as well have been hieroglyphics. One tutor's private notes, discovered centuries later, paint a heartbreaking picture. His Majesty tries with great effort, but retains nothing. I explain a concept, and by the next day it is as if he has never heard it. His attention wanders. Sometimes he stares at nothing for long periods. When asked what he is thinking, he cannot say. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn yet. As Charles entered puberty, or what should have been puberty, his body betrayed him in new ways. He grew, but barely. While other royal teenagers shot up in height, Charles remained stunted, childlike. His voice never deepened. Body hair? Almost none. The characteristics that marked a boy becoming a man simply didn't happen. The court physicians held hushed conferences. They observed what they dared not put in official records. The prince showed no interest in women. No interest in men either. He seemed to exist in a strange childlike state, neither boy nor man, but something trapped between. This terrified the court, because Charles had one job above all others: to produce an heir. The entire Spanish Empire, stretching from Europe to the Americas to the Philippines, needed the royal bloodline to continue. But how could a man who couldn't grow a proper beard father children? At age 18, they decided to find out. Charles was married to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a 17-year-old French princess who was, by all accounts, beautiful, intelligent, and healthy. The contrast between bride and groom shocked wedding guests. She was radiant. He was ghastly. She walked gracefully down the aisle. He shuffled, supported by attendants. When it came time for the kiss, observers noted that Marie-Louise had to steel herself visibly before leaning in. The wedding night was a disaster. Not the kind that makes for funny stories. The kind that determines the fate of empires. Charles, it became clear, was completely incapable of consummating the marriage. Not unwilling. Incapable. His body simply didn't function as a man's should. Marie-Louise, raised in the sophisticated French court, tried everything. She was patient. She was kind. She even, according to palace gossip, tried to instruct her husband in the basics of marital relations. Nothing worked. Years passed. No pregnancy. The queen underwent humiliating examinations to determine if she was the problem. The physicians declared her perfectly fertile. The problem, everyone knew but no one would say officially, was the king. The pressure was crushing. Both Charles and Marie-Louise were subjected to increasingly desperate fertility treatments. She was forced to drink vile concoctions of herbs and animal organs. He was made to consume potions that included ground pearls and bull's blood. At one point, a specialist prescribed eating the dried penis of a stag. Nothing worked, because nothing could work. Charles's reproductive system was as malformed as the rest of him. But the story gets even more bizarre. Charles's mother, desperate for a grandchild to continue the Habsburg line, consulted mystics and holy men. One suggested Charles was cursed and that sleeping next to holy relics might break the spell. When that failed, she escalated to something that still shocks historians today. She had her son sleep next to corpses. Yes, you heard that right. The Queen Mother arranged for Charles to spend nights lying beside exhumed bodies of saints and former kings, including his own father. The theory was that the holy essence of the dead would somehow cure his impotence. Picture it. The King of Spain, drooling and malformed, lying next to decomposing corpses in the hope of gaining the ability to father a child. 10 years of marriage. 10 years of failed attempts. 10 years of humiliation. Then Marie-Louise died suddenly at age 26. The official cause was appendicitis, but rumors swirled. Had she been poisoned? Had the strain of her situation driven her to suicide? We'll never know. What we do know is that Charles was genuinely devastated. Despite everything, he had grown to love his wife, perhaps the only person who had shown him real kindness. Within months, the pressure to remarry began. The council selected Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a famously fertile family. Her parents had produced 17 children. Surely, the advisors reasoned, such robust genes could overcome even Charles's deficiencies. They were wrong. Maria Anna, despite her healthy lineage, never became pregnant. Not once. By this time, Charles's health had deteriorated even further. Courtiers whispered that he looked like an old man, though he was barely 30. His hair fell out in patches. His teeth, what few could be seen behind that protruding jaw, rotted and fell out. He shuffled when he walked, when he could walk at all. The seizures started in his 30s. Without warning, Charles would collapse, his body convulsing, foam mixing with the ever-present drool. When he recovered, he often didn't recognize the people around him. He began talking about seeing ghosts, hearing voices, feeling invisible hands touching him. The court was terrified. Was their king going mad on top of everything else? The nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched, took on new meaning. People genuinely believed Charles was under a curse. The Spanish Inquisition got involved. Exorcists were brought in. At one point, the king's own confessor was arrested on charges of using witchcraft to worsen the royal condition. The trial was a sensation. Though, of course, no amount of exorcism could cure genetic damage. Charles himself believed he was cursed. In lucid moments, he would weep and ask what he had done to deserve such punishment. He wore amulets, carried holy relics, submitted to increasingly bizarre purification rituals. Nothing helped, because nothing could help. His genetic code was his curse, written into every cell of his body. Subscribe to our channel if you want to uncover more suppressed historical truths your textbooks never told you. Because this story is about to reach its horrifying conclusion. By age 35, Charles looked ancient. Contemporary descriptions are hard to read. His skin hung loose on his skeletal frame. His famous jaw seemed to grow even more pronounced as the rest of his face wasted away. He was completely bald, his scalp covered in sores. He could barely walk, shuffling a few steps before needing to rest. His speech, always difficult, became nearly impossible to understand. But the worst was yet to come. In his final years, Charles began to mentally deteriorate rapidly. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, drool pooling on his clothes. When spoken to, he often didn't respond. When he did speak, he rambled about demons and angels, about his dead wife, about children he would never have. The king of one of the world's greatest empires had become a hollow shell. The end came in 1700. Charles was 38 years old, not elderly by any standard, but his body was shutting down. He couldn't eat even his specially prepared mush. He couldn't stand without help. He spent his days propped up in bed, gasping for breath, his hydrocephalic head causing unbearable pressure. On November 1st, after days of agony, Charles II died. What happened next would shock even the physicians who had treated him for years. The autopsy. If you thought The Living Charles was a medical horror show, his corpse was something out of a nightmare. The royal physicians tasked with embalming their king cut open the body and recoiled in horror. Their report, written in clinical Latin but dripping with barely concealed shock, described a body that shouldn't have been able to sustain life as long as it did. His body did not contain a single drop of blood. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. Charles's circulatory system had essentially shut down. His blood had either clotted or was simply absent. His heart was described as the size of a peppercorn. Not literally that small, but shriveled, blackened, barely recognizable as the organ that should pump life through a body. His lungs were corroded, their word for what we might now recognize as massive scarring from repeated infections. Imagine lung tissue that looked more like pumice stone than organs meant for breathing. His intestines were described as rotten and gangrenous. Parts of his digestive system had literally died while he was still alive, explaining the horrific pain he endured in his final years. But the most telling detail, the one that confirmed what everyone suspected but no one had dared say officially. Charles had only one testicle, and it was black as coal. This single atrophied, dead piece of tissue was all that remained of what should have been a functioning reproductive system. No wonder he couldn't father children. It's a miracle he survived puberty at all. And his brain? Remember that oversized, fluid-filled head? The physicians found it was indeed full of water. The hydrocephalus had left barely any room for actual brain tissue. How Charles had managed to function at all, how he had managed to speak and think and rule, however poorly, was a medical mystery. The physicians who performed this autopsy must have stood there, covered in the gore of their dissection, and marveled that this collection of malformed organs had somehow sustained life for nearly 4 decades. Every system was compromised. Every organ was damaged. It was as if Charles's body had been at war with itself from the moment of conception. Modern genetic analysis has given us the why behind this horror show. Remember that inbreeding coefficient of 0.254? That means a quarter of Charles's genome consisted of identical copies of genes. In those repeated sequences lurked the instructions for his destruction. Scientists now believe Charles suffered from at least 2 major genetic disorders. The first was combined pituitary hormone deficiency. His body couldn't produce the hormones needed for normal growth and development. This explained his short stature, his inability to sexually mature, his muscle weakness, his cognitive problems. His pituitary gland, the master controller of the endocrine system, was essentially non-functional. The second was likely distal renal tubular acidosis. His kidneys couldn't properly regulate his blood chemistry. This caused the rickets that bent his legs, the muscle weakness that left him unable to walk, and possibly contributed to the hydrocephalus that swelled his skull. Either condition alone would have been challenging. Together, they created a cascade of failures throughout his body. Add in the Habsburg jaw itself, a genetic condition called mandibular prognathism, and you had a perfect storm of genetic disasters. But here's the truly horrifying part. Charles wasn't uniquely unlucky. He was the inevitable result of systematic inbreeding. Of the 34 children born to Spanish Habsburg monarchs, more than half died before age 10. The dynasty was literally breeding itself to death, and Charles was simply the final, most extreme example. When Charles died without an heir, it triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that would reshape Europe. The Spanish Empire, built over centuries, shattered because one man's body was too broken to produce a single child. The Habsburg line that had ruled Spain for nearly 200 years ended not with an assassination or a revolution, but with a king so inbred his own flesh betrayed him. The Bourbon dynasty that replaced the Habsburgs learned the lesson. While royal marriages remained political, the extreme inbreeding that created Charles II was never repeated. The nightmare of the Habsburg jaw, the horror of Charles's autopsy, the tragedy of a king who couldn't chew his own food became cautionary tales whispered in royal courts across Europe. Charles II remains in medical textbooks today as the ultimate example of genetic collapse. Students studying genetics see his portrait and learn about inbreeding coefficients. His Habsburg jaw has become shorthand for the dangers of closed gene pools. In a strange way, his suffering contributed to our understanding of heredity and the importance of genetic diversity. But beyond the medical curiosity, beyond the political consequences, there was a human being. Charles II lived every day in a body that was failing him. He endured constant pain, humiliation, and the knowledge that he was failing in his most basic duty as king. He was mocked as the bewitched when his only curse was his ancestry. In his final letter, dictated because he could no longer hold a pen, Charles wrote about hoping to find peace in death that had eluded him in life. For a man who had endured 4 decades of physical and mental anguish, who had been propped up on the throne like a grotesque puppet, death must have seemed like mercy. The portrait hangs now in the Museo del Prado in Madrid. Visitors pause before it, struck by the obvious deformities even the court painter couldn't fully hide. But now you know the truth behind that image. You know about the jaw that couldn't close, the tongue that couldn't fit, the body that couldn't function, the genome that had turned against itself. Charles II of Spain wasn't cursed by witches or demons. He was cursed by his own family tree, a tree so tangled it had become a noose. His story stands as perhaps history's starkest warning about the dangers of genetic isolation. In trying to keep power in the family, the Habsburgs destroyed their own bloodline. The next time you see a royal portrait, remember Charles II. Remember that behind the crowns and scepters and royal grandeur, biology always has the final say. And sometimes that final say is horrifying beyond imagination. What do you think? If you could go back and warn the Habsburgs about what their marriages would create, would they have listened? Or was power more intoxicating than the survival of their own children? Let me know in the comments below. Join our community of history seekers who aren't afraid to look at the darkest corners of the past. Because every time you share genetic diversity, somewhere a Habsburg ghost breathes a sigh of relief.